So here we are with we're on the side of we believe there is a God, and we do not believe that there is no God. And so why don't you start walking us through this as it relates to the atheist side?
Yeah, you set it up with the square of opposition. So why don't you briefly explain to our audience what's going on here, and so that they can kind of get a sense of why you were approaching this topic, and how, in the sense of why you wanted, how you went about, showing your work, so to speak,
Sure.
to show that the weak atheist position is would if we allowed it to be, affirms a semantic collapse, affirms in your conclusion that you could simultaneously be a theist, an agnostic, and an atheist all at the same time, which is a total mess.
Yeah,
So,
just approach that however you want to, Steve. And if you want to start here, you can. I can go.
Real easy. Okay, so the way I approach this is twofold. One, Dr. Oppie, Graham Oppie, who I think is probably the most brilliant atheist contemporary philosopher over time. Great guy. He's been on my show. I've had the man is just beyond genius. He noted this. He noted this in one of his books, that if you allow for weak atheism, you should have to allow for weak theism. And there was an argument that I had prior to this paper that I do mention in here somewhat, but it was called the WASP argument. And it was a weak atheist special pleading argument. It basically just said, if you allow for weak atheism, you must allow for weak theism, else you're special pleading. So I just took what Dr. Oppie wrote and kind of added that without special, because if not, you don't allow it, it's your special pleading. That's a fallacy, right? If you're saying, hey, I want atheism, which is normally understood in academia standard, which means just if you see nothing else with it, you're to assume the author is meaning the belief that God does not exist. In most cases, that's how it's always been understood in philosophy the last 400 years. And so when you allow for the, I just want atheism to be a lack of belief, you have to allow theists to make that same move. So if
this is important, Steve, I want to highlight this because I think nobody really makes that move, and pointing this out, I think, clarifies everything. So I want people to really focus on, if you're going to say about atheism that atheism is not just the belief that God does not exist, but it can also be the
lack of belief
that God does exist, or whatever. Then you have to allow the theist to do the same thing, or else it's special pleading. And you point out uncontroversially here. So go ahead. I just wanted to underline what you're saying.
Yeah, but I mean, you're right.
So.
Yeah, nobody takes that position of a weak theist position that I'm aware of. Well, I just lack a belief in the non-existence of God, right? And into that claim. But I mean, what would that debate be like? It'd just be a lack atheist and a lack theist.
I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Yeah, it's really boring.
They'd just be staring at each other for 2.5 hours. I don't have a positive claim. I don't have a positive claim either, and nothing happens.
So. All right, Steve, go for it.
Yeah. It is funny because theists don't make that particular claim. One, because it would be kind of contradictory to the essence of what Christianity actually is, right? Because the whole essence of Christianity is believing Christ was the risen Savior, believing God. That's kind of the crux of Christianity right there. So it wouldn't make sense for most theists in many contexts to say, hey, look, theism is merely a lack of belief that God does not exist, although they could for maybe some other type of non-monotheistic God. But they don't, right? Which is to credit to them. But the argument isn't that somebody's making it. The argument is that they could. You have to allow it if they did. Again, these are hypotheticals, and a lot of people don't understand hypotheticals very well. I've actually had people, I'm not even joking, that said my paper is wrong because I used implicatures. I use if P then Q, which is basically the start of every argument. Basically, from modus ponens to tollens, it's all of them are conditionals. That's how you do an argument. And so I had people argue, oh well, these are just ifs. Oh, yes, that's how our argument is started.
Yeah, you're saying if this, then this follows from that. That's all you're saying. And then, of course, we get into, and in a lot of the ways that you frame spinning off of this table that we can get into is a lot of it is if this or if this and then you run them through the matrix. So you set it up with various operators to try to see, is this valid? It's like checking your math in a math problem, right? And that's basically what a truth table is. It's a poor analogy, but it's an analogy to help people get their head around it, what we're going to be looking at. And so you run all this, and so it seems like what you're trying to show is stemming off of Oppie, you're going to interact with Anthony Fleur's contention, where he's trying to make this position into where you can have no positive claims, just a negative position. And that's kind of the framework between Oppie and Fleu, are stemming from Oppie's claim about this idea of a lack atheism, or a lack of belief in the non-existence of God. If that's a valid position, whether or not anyone takes it is irrelevant. It's
Correct.
just they could. And
well, and if you're going to do that over there, then it means it's possible to do that over here. I guess.
Right, because that is essentially because
that was a special
what
pleading,
you argue
by definition.
Yeah, and just to put this clear up front, and this is in the this is in the square of opposition, but the claim of the weak atheist, and if we were to posit this weak theist, both of those claims are in fact claims, are positions that the agnostic, the agnostic qua agnostic does hold, that they lack a belief in the non-existence of God and they lack a belief in the existence of God simultaneously, which is allowed. That is agnosticism. And so if you're, so for all of so if you're tempted to take the weak theism position, the same result happens as the weak atheism in your paper, that no, you're both agnostics.
Yeah, logically speaking, and that's what. Okay, so
right.
Yes, it's Anthony Flew. I have probably every so often I say Anthony, and I don't mean to. I know it's Anthony. There's no H in it, but yes, Anthony Flew. But okay, so there's another paper out there by a guy named Dr. Burgess Jackson. I'm sure you guys are familiar with him. He wrote a very brilliant paper refuting Flew's argument, and when he did that, he used what's called a square of opposition, and so. I like the idea of using what's called a semiotic square of opposition, where it's not categorical. You're not talking about all S or Ps. What you're talking about is a relationship between contraries. And contraries would be two things that could be false at the same time, but not true at the same time. And so I was like, hey, I like the way Burgess Jackson related agnosticism and theism to the square of opposition. And so what I did was I took that and I ran with it to show how to prove that if you do use these terms the way that these atheist organizations want people to use them, then you could logically have a person that's semantically called a theist, an atheist, and an agnostic, which seems to me an axiological depreciation of the verbiage. Because if you say, hey, look, I'm an atheist, theist, agnostic to somebody, they're going to look at you like you're insane, like you don't know what you're talking about. But this shows it is possible semantically if you allow these types of what's called sensu lato, or general usage, or very broad uses of terms. And so I start off with a square of opposition here, which is showing. And the way this works is very simple. These are relationships between terms. So the way you would read this is very simple. B is a verb, is an intentional verb called belief. S is a subject, and G is the proposition God exists. So basically, just read that as S believes G, or S believes God exists. It's simple. It's not that difficult to learn the logic. I think everybody agrees that is theism. I mean, if you don't agree with that, then I don't know where you want to go with it, right? But I think that most people would agree that if you believe in God, we're going to semantically call that a theist. Does anybody not agree with that?
We agree.
And everything follows from that. These relationships show what's called a contradiction. In other words, you start with the negation of that. So if you have BSG, the negation is not BSG. It shows the contrary, which would be atheism. And it shows the some contraries, which is the agnostic position, and then subalternations, which just means that by implication, if you believe there's a God, you don't believe there is not a God. So if you read this, S believes G, it actually implies that S does not believe that there is no God, right? Because if you're a theist, you don't believe there is no God. You believe there is a God. So these are all relationships. That's all the square of opposition does here.
Right. And you have it set up like that because, in case people are wondering, because of the way agnosticism works, the subalternations don't work in reverse.
No, that'd be a contrary error. Right. That's literally what the fallacy of the converse would be.
Right. That's what I'm explaining to the audience, so that they know that just because I believe in God, therefore I also don't believe in not God, those work together. But you're going to argue, which is kind of what I set up, that unless you want to be agnostic, it doesn't go the other way.
Hey,
Yeah,
before we go any further,
go ahead.
Steve, I know you've to quote the guy from Modern Day Debate, James. You've got one in the chamber.
Hey,
But
James.
Yeah.
What?
let me
No,
say.
what? I do what for what? I get along with
Oh,
James.
it sounded like you were about to say something. I just wanted to jump in real quick and just say, super chats that are coming in, we so appreciate that. We'll get to those toward the end, but thank you so much. But yeah, so where
you want
where
to
would
read them
go?
Well, they
now?
don't want it to go the other way, because if you're an atheist who simply lacks a belief in the God of the subalternation went the other way, fallaciously, then all of a sudden you have to say that you believe there is no God. so it runs you into the positive plane.
It's funny that you mention it, because one of the criticisms I have is that people will say things that are true but irrelevant, and it's called a fallacy of irrelevant thesis. It's something that, yeah, you're right, but who cares? So, like, a person will argue, well, merely because I don't believe in God, it doesn't imply that I believe there is no God. Yeah, absolutely, you're right. The subalternation doesn't work in the converse. We all are aware of this, but that's not everything I've ever argued. What I've argued is, if you look at the bottom of this, right, at the bottom right-hand corner, that not BSG, that's what they're wanting atheism to be thought of. That's ambiguous, because you cannot rest on that position. It must be you are one of the other two positions of the top or the bottom left. There's no other options. This is logic. If you don't believe, it's because you believe there's no God, or you have no position either way, which gives a nice section of your epistemic states of any given proposition. So on any proposition, doesn't matter what the proposition is, there's three rational epistemic pieces of the pie there. You can divide it up, believe, disbelieve, or have no position either way. Nice and simple, right? So it doesn't matter what the proposition is. But they'll say, well, I merely lack a belief. And I try to explain to them, that's ambiguous, because I don't know if you lack a belief because you believe there's no God, or you have no position either way, which are so vastly different positions, right? I mean, I think most people would agree that not having a position on it directly and believing there's no God are two completely different positions and require different reasoning for them. I believe I'm one of the very few that will argue that agnostic requires a burden of proof. Not believing requires a burden of proof. This is why Matt Dillahunty can't stand me, and he will argue till he's blue in the face that I'm wrong, and he'll say Steve's wrong on this. Atheism doesn't have a burden of proof. Well, look, I've had Dr. Carey write 2 blogs on me disagreeing with Matt on that. He's an atheist. He just thinks that the burden of proof has already been met for atheism, which is a hell of a claim, by the way. But he does agree that atheism has a burden of proof. So if atheism in the negative, if Matt wants to argue, that still has to have a burden of proof to be rational. Why is it you failed to affirm or deny the proposition? What is it that made you deadlock on this proposition? That is a reason why you were not a theist or an atheist. That's your burden of proof. It's called an epistemic burden of proof.
And real quick, I think I've heard you say, and maybe I'm wrong, that agnostics should have a sort of a burden of proof if they're aware of the arguments, because they need to be able to explain to you why these arguments for them don't settle the issue.
Yeah, one of my friends, matter of fact, who I acknowledge in this paper, who literally helped me get my thoughts together and motivate me to write this paper and get it out there, was Dr. Malik, because I read his paper defending redefining atheism and the burden of proof, I think is the name of the paper. But he argued that very same thing. He's like, look, if you are agnostic, you have a burden to meet. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And so if agnostics have a burden to meet, why wouldn't a atheist have a burden? They're the same position, as they proved.
Far be it for me to say anything sympathetic towards Matt's position, but I will, but it doesn't help him any. Okay. I would be sympathetic to the I have no burden thing. So I guess I was just going to try to say this the best I can. If you are unaware of the beliefs that you lack, that doesn't change your epistemic beliefs that you do have, right? So you can't be forced to take a position if you are completely ignorant that you lack a belief in like monotheism, if the concept is extremely foreign to you, like it's never been considered. But
like Noel Plum. Yeah. You know Noel Plum, Steve?
Yeah, he's just on my channel a few weeks. He was just on my channel literally a few weeks ago. You don't watch any of my stuff. I get it.
I do occasionally, but
a long time. Yeah,
but we're making progress in our relationship here, Steve, because here we sit.
Good.
So,
yes.
but Noel Plum,
we got connections, man.
Yeah, he made this point about what if you had this man slug or some kind of weird slug that had a face of a man but the body of a slug, and you've never even heard of this thing. But so like it's reasonable to say you're like completely like, I mean,
in a vacuum with respect to the existence.
You don't even don't know.
Right. But I think
Dr. Oppie has a term for this. It's called innocent. Right?
Oh, yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Oppie has a term for that. He calls it innocence on P, which
That's
means that you're unaware.
I think he says that in arguing about gods, doesn't he?
But I think what Matt runs, where he's wrong is the fact that he can consider himself, acknowledge a lack of belief in something that other people have positive beliefs for. You're no longer innocent. So
he's not. Yeah, no, he holds there is no God. And matter of fact, it's funny because Aaron Ra, who I go way back with as well. One of the reasons we don't speak any longer is because of this very topic. Because Aaron's wrong. Sorry, Aaron. I do have a lot of respect for him, but he's completely wrong on this topic. And he'll assert not just gods do not exist. He'll assert that they're impossible. That is a very, very high bar to meet. Matter of fact, I would say that you have belief. You have knowledge, you have certainty, then you have impossibilities. When you're talking about impossibilities, you need, to me, a proof by impossibility. You need some kind of modal argument using Alaic logic that shows that it is impossible to have a God. And I don't think Aaron's at that level to even use modal logic, right? To use modalities. Yeah. So when you're arguing that it's impossible to have a God, that's way beyond just saying I believe there's no God.
Yeah. So if you don't know, if you're unaware of the beliefs you lack, that's a complete innocent and opposite. That's a completely different thing than acknowledging the lack of belief that you have. And once you acknowledge the lack of belief you have, I think that entails a positive claim of some kind about the world and the way that you engage in it. And so therefore you're guilty, not innocent.
But here's the thing, though. It's not a positive claim on the proposition. It could be a positive claim somewhere else, though, right? Because these are agnostic has an indirect position on the proposition, right? They suspend judgment, which is a positive claim. I'm positively claiming I'm suspending judgment, right? Any negative claim could be turned into a positive. We all know that. So these are all positive claims in that sense. They're at least in relationship to the proposition. So when you ask an agnostic, why is it that you did not believe God exists, or why is it you don't believe God does not exist? They need to have a reason for that. Of course I do. I'm not going to get into that. But I think that everybody should have a reason to affirm, deny, or suspend judgment. If not, then what are we talking about as far as rationality? If I said to you, Braxton, X equals X, and you say, Steve, I don't believe you, I'm not going to take you as a rational person, right?
Like, well, that's the end of the conversation.
Right. I'm going to kind of want to know what your burden of proof is why you failed to affirm X equals X. Yeah. And a lot of people just don't get that. They're like, I have no burden of proof if I don't believe something. Yeah, you do. Because to be rational, you need to justify, at least to yourself, why you failed to affirm something. And it can be as simple as an a priori knowledge of X equals X. If you don't believe that's something, you need to have a reason for that. If anybody thinks that you don't need a reason for that, then how do you talk about being rational?
Unless you're innocent.
That's a fundamental law of logic.
Yeah. Unless you're the innocent person that can postpone judgment.
Let's get real basic with this. What I hear a lot from skeptics online and in the comments and things like that is to say, look, what you guys are all missing is that on the one hand, we're talking about what I believe, and on the other hand, we're talking about what I know. And I don't know. What agnostic is the negation of gnostic, knowledge, all this sort of thing. And here I am not knowing, but that's a different question from what I believe.
I disagree. Let me tell
you why. You would and explain
why.
Yeah,
because and who I think it was it Emerson Green? I'm doing a review on I think it was Emerson Green's video where they said he's something similar. Was it? But somebody was saying very similar that Gnostic and agnostic have this weird relationship that it's just A in front of Gnostic, and that was never the case. As many people know, Thomas Henry Huxley coined the term agnosticism as a neologism to represent a normative epistemic principle. To him, it was a method. It was, if you do not have sufficient reason to believe something on scientific grounding, then you should fail to believe something. You should only believe something if you have scientific reason to do it. That's what's his method, and he called that principle agnosticism. It had nothing to do with Gnosticism. Matter of fact, he didn't even use gnosis in the word when he coined that. Believe it or not, he used the word nous, N-O-S, G-N-O-S. And what he wanted nous to represent was the illusion of having knowledge, because he felt that theists and atheists at his time were making claims about God not based upon science. And so even a belief that God exists, he felt was unsustainable. So he used the term gnos to say, hey, look, all you atheists, all you theists, neither of you have any reason to be talking about this being God, because you have no information about him that to even deliberate based upon scientific grounds. And so he thought that they had the illusion of having knowledge or information about God that they didn't have. That's why. So agnostic has nothing to do with Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a first to fourth century belief system that a being named Sophia fell from Plemora, which was the heavens, and when she fell, she instilled on everybody this esoteric knowledge, or this hidden knowledge called gnosis, and that was the divine knowledge of the unknown God that created the heavens. Because in the Gnostic tradition, they believe this deity called Yaldabaoth created the universe, but didn't create the heavens. And this was an evil trickster being, kind of like Loki. And so the Gnostic belief held that knowledge was this instilled thing given to us by Sophia, what's called the Syzygy of Jesus, and has nothing to do with epistemic knowledge. Absolutely nothing. So when we're talking about like to know something in the epistemic sense, this has no relevance to Gnosticism or gnosis. So the term agnostic is not even.
Well, that being said, Steve, how would you still address the conceptual point that's being made? That I could say, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I don't have a problem when people use a term like Gnostic to mean an epistemic modifier, like an adjective. I get it, right? So if you want to say, look, we'll start with theist, because people generally have no contention with this. If you say, I believe there's a God, that's a dostastic claim, right? It's not a claim to knowledge. We all agree on that, right? Knowledge is a subset of belief. If you want to raise that higher and make a higher degree of claim, saying, I know there's a God, that's going to require a much more stringent burden of proof to meet those requirements, right? You're going to have to explain what theory of knowledge you're using, what's your justification, show that the proposition is true, that you believe it, and that it's justified under justified true belief. A lot more complicated, right? But if you want to say, I'm not just a theist, I'm a Gnostic theist, in that you're using that term Gnostic to modify the belief to knowledge, okay, that's not a big deal. But the problem comes in is when you use the term atheism. The only way that would work is if you have atheism as the belief. Because if atheism is the belief, I can then raise that to knowledge, because knowledge is a subset of belief. But if I say atheism is merely a lack of belief, there's nothing there to raise. You don't have the belief first to even be a knowledge claim. You're not modifying a belief at that point. That's why agnostic atheism in the weak case of merely lacking a belief makes no sense. See?
Yeah, that
and
was.
that's the point of your paper.
Yeah. And that really, in some ways, yeah. I mean, I don't get into the whole Gnostic thing too much as far as the Gnostic atheism. I was going to kind of hopefully get with Rasmussen on that, and maybe we can write something together. But the point of
weak atheism is basically agnosticism, and if it's not, then we have all kinds of semantic chaos, pretty much.
Correct.
Collapse.
Yeah.
Would it be a good summary of all this, Steve, to say, and I said it kind of this way at the top, to say, look, what your paper shows is, you're arguing is that your paper shows that that if we allowed theists to make the same move that atheists make to a weak atheism or lack theism, you have to make the theist allowed to say, okay, I'm not saying I believe there is a God, I'm just saying I lack a belief that no God exists. And then if and you really see this when you do this with the theist, because then the weak theist and the weak atheist and the agnostic all share the same exact spot, and they become three things, and there's a collapse in terminology because three names for the same thing, and that's primarily,
that's why I call it semantic collapse. That's what I personally call that, for that very reason, because they lose any value of the terms. And by the way, you don't even need to have theist in there. You can get semantic collapse just with weak atheism, because weak atheism is logically agnosticism. If you don't have a positive epistemic status, in other words, if you don't believe something like God doesn't exist, then the only other logical position for you to be is neither believes God exists nor believes God does not exist, which is agnostic. And so then you now have atheism being used to mean the same thing as agnostic. There's a semantic collapse there. Now, some people could argue agnostic means knowledge, or this other stuff is irrelevant. We're not talking about the epistemological domain. We are talking about the ontological domain of God's existing, right? So it has to do with a specific proposition of an existential nature. So when we're talking about on the proposition of God existing, Agnostic means you have no position either way. That's every place will tell anybody this. It has nothing to do with knowledge. Anybody thinks otherwise, I'm guaranteed you're wrong. Go read. Nobody ever says if you're talking about the God existing or not. Agnostic means anything other than you have no position either way. And so, we're good. Yeah.
I was going to say, but Steve, if you actually did this without theism, you wouldn't have a pretty square.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. I like the fact that I actually try to make it square as possible. I don't want to
can do it. Doesn't mean you
the square
should
of opposition
do
is always in a
without-
rectangle. No, seriously, the square of opposition, if you see it, is almost always in a rectangle form,
Oh, yeah.
which drives me nuts. It's got a
hey,
square.
let-
Just because you can do it without theism doesn't mean you should.
Would it be okay
Right,
with you,
exactly.
Steve, if we did some questions at this point? Or
Absolutely,
you think we're
yeah. No,
Okay.
go ahead. Questions.
Well,
and
let's hit
super chat,
Siggy
get 'em out.
first
Yeah.
because Siggy has been just
More generous than our
he loves this
normal
stuff.
crowd.
we got normal crowd that's pretty generous, but Siggy's
Yeah,
going crazy
I'm just
today.
messing with them.
So Siggy became a channel member, and I was throwing up a while ago all the people who he was making channel members. It was kind of like drinks all around. I've never seen anything like that.
I brought everybody over. I brought John over, Siggy. Hey, we're gonna make you popular, man. Yeah.
I appreciate it. I really do.